Hi, my name is Ethan Barnhart, founder of Vulcan Digital, and today I'm going to be discussing building a cybersecurity assessment engine during my time at Highground that automated the business risk interview process and the vulnerability scanning operations that came together in a final deliverable known as the presentation of findings within the smart and safe assessment that we offered to the small and mid-market. Now, the purpose of the smart and safe assessment was a cross-disciplinary comprehensive assessment that combined things like ITIL change management practices, financial analysis of business risk, the vulnerability scanning information that came off of a technical scanner we deploy in a client environment, along with a number of other factors to do a trend pattern analysis on how an organization was making cybersecurity decisions and outlay a program path that was most appropriate to their compliance context, their clientele, and a kind of reasonable security for that organization with limited budget and limited resources to go and attain cybersecurity outcomes. And I was the primary analyst responsible for making those trends and analyses possible. I joked that for several years in my career at that point, I was a professional palm reader. I could combine the security protections data for end-of-life devices, the IT change management practices, and anecdotal interviews from key stakeholders, and the budgets over the last year or 2 years to pinpoint a pretty clear pattern in decision making and tell people what needed to happen in order to implement a common sense cybersecurity for organizations that were smaller or medium sized and don't have endless budgets to expend on something like cybersecurity, especially when they're just stepping in and trying to avoid patch quilting and bringing tools into the environment that don't address underlying issues. So, as I walk through the creation of this solution that automates the assessment so that we can have scaled delivery of that assessment in the market, I'm going to be going through the requirements involved that were defined internally as a result of primarily my familiarity with the process as one of the main people executing it, and the overall design process as we iterate from step to step in different versions of the application and the technical aspects in the solution once it's in the market and being delivered to clients. So if you want to go through all of that front to back, you certainly can, but if this video runs long, I've provided timestamps in the description where you can jump around to any of those key areas that might interest you or pick out things that catch your eye. So let's jump into it. Coming from a design background, a product design background, the root of all problems and the root of all solutions is going to be the pain points. What are people feeling? And we're looking inward at this point and understanding what about this solution is working and what about this isn't. It's a service in the market that does take a lot of effort to produce because it is comprehensive, drawing from several disciplines, and the interview process via phone is inconsistent. It could take hours with high value individuals who are at the executive level in the organization. Their time is precious, and it often requires follow-up at times with open items that weren't explored to completion. And that leaps into the next adjoining point here is that coordinating with clients for those times to meet with those high value individuals and making sure that that person we're talking to is the correct point of authority on that information to ensure its accuracy extends the project timelines in a way that impacts cash flow, because this assessment being delivered to these ideal audiences is a firm fixed engagement. It's fixed bids so that they pay what they see on the sticker and they don't have to worry about overflows in duration or effort being expended, so that there's less risk for them, and with any value we deliver, it's value on our side and obligation for us to produce. And analyzing the client risk and threat data by hand, something I'm doing at this point from my sophomore year in college up to my senior year in college, it's being done by hand, drawing the red thread between all of these different disciplines to suss out patterns in an organization that we can correctly call out and then address with common sense, low-hanging fruit kind of solutions and produce that program outlay, can seriously reduce the margin on a fixed bid engagement if it takes too long, and oftentimes it might. So we need a way of addressing these core issues. So we're going to start with some requirements to define the problem. Ideally, we should produce a solution that automates the interview process to the maximum degree possible through a series of context-specific questions asked in an assessment fashion, similar to something you might do for a free self-assessment online. There's a lot of those right now. There wasn't at this point in time. Or taking something like a professional certification where you sit down and go through an assessment that might have a branching pattern of logic behind it, where it's only going to ask you the most appropriate questions to your knowledge domain or press into you further if there's things you don't know about on a particular topic to gauge the depth of where you're at on something, right? We want to mimic that same approach, and it should be done in a web application portal format. The questions should have role-based security around them. We need question-level security because one of the parts of this engagement that's important to understand is we're asking sensitive budget and financial exposure questions of ownership, right? In these small and medium-sized organizations, somebody could have a high degree of personal investment in the organization, and it's plants, property, equipment, business lines of credit in their name where they're a guarantor with collateral elsewhere that isn't necessarily in scope for the business or some other prior holdings, or they could have financial assets that are potentially impacted apart from the individual and corporate firewall that they don't want to disclose to other employees. So it's important, obviously, as a basic sense starting point, that clients shouldn't be able to see into each other's data as they're taking an assessment simultaneously. But then within a single client, certain employees shouldn't be able to access close hold, bordering on confidential information that an owner wouldn't want disclosed amongst each other. Then the assessment platform should have a quick enrollment process that allows for asynchronous completion. This is post-COVID, and for a lot of these organizations in their lived realities, I need to be able to run and gun, quickly complete something in my own time on my own device from wherever I can complete it from. And that's a reality we have to accommodate for. The solution should include, ideally, an interpretive wizard that aggregates the answers accrued through all of this assessment process, along with that security protections data that comes off of a scanner we deploy in their environment to run vulnerability scanning with. And at the intersection of those two disciplines, be able to do most of the pattern analysis I would normally be doing by hand, just to catch the most common cases and the most common callouts that show up in a final report, and automate that analyst work to the maximum degree possible. And the questions we're asking oftentimes are a pattern. They're a variation on a theme, so these questions individually should be editable in some administrative backend or view on the final portal that people at Highground are capable of accessing and maintaining. And with that administrative question bank, ideally we should be able to Lego brick together assessments that can be saved as a single standalone format or something we can pull off of the shelf and ask the right kind of questions to the right kind of client in a kind of side-loading model where I can grab the most appropriate assessment that's pre-baked for the most appropriate client. And then, we're going to get into the proof of concept here and prototyping and the early ideas as they coalesce and different things that come together to provide value and make this a scalable solution moving forward. We have an existing spreadsheet for this assessment that's used in the service delivery, and it's individual discretion of the person performing interviews to ask those questions in a particular sequence, again, depending on the context and what they can suss out from the person they're talking to. And those will be used to develop our core views as we move forward. But another key aspect here is those vulnerability scanners. And vulnerability scanners up until this point could be deployed in environment and operated over VNC, where there's manual coordination on the kind of scans being run, the contents of those packages, and the timing of all of it. And the data can be shuttled more ideally using a secured command and control model. If we have some orchestration in the background that can automate most of that manual work, relying on those same VNC connections for the occasional administrative task or the preliminary configuration in an environment, so that we get the scanner seated and then everything after that could be on autopilot, that's going to be a huge aspect of lowering the margin drags on this service delivery as well. Then scan results and assessment answers can be organized on a per client and per assessment basis in a database and fed to an internal report generation wizard. This is where we collect everything in together at one point, and then according to the client and according to the assessment that was performed, any number of that, any variation on that information can live out in the cloud or with people who are taking assessments in flight in a lot of different contexts, but they have to come down to one single point, and then that generation wizard ideally is something out of band that only a Highground employee has access to or can run when it's actually needed. So the first aspect that I mentioned here is going to be the prototyping and building assessment views. And I'm only going to cover this briefly just so you can see an example of what the service delivery spreadsheet looked like. and the kind of views that we were building in the web application. And you'll get to see more of this later when we circle back, but just taking this from first to second to third point that I had mentioned, we're already starting work on this. I was one of the people who was responsible for both a web version of this and a skiffed version of this that's only on the desktop in those environments where clients had requirements stating that they couldn't egress security protections data regardless of how secure it was. It's something that's close hold. You need to compartmentalize information. You do have to accommodate for some of those things, and the process of building this was going to be something done in Windows presentation forms, the desktop C# version of that story, and building the equivalent thing with a shared service library between the two applications working in both contexts in a MVC, more traditional web app approach. The vulnerability aspect of this, doing scans, you can see a high-level overview of what the solution looked like and what we had to build. An end administrator inside of Highground is going to be able to use that real VNC connection to configure certain items necessary for the solution in place. But they would also be able to go in through the web application service that we were hosting for the orchestration of these scans and the facilitation of this assessment. And they would be able to configure automated times and automated scan packages by IP address. You have your subnetting with CIDR ranges to make things as convenient as possible. Whitelisting or blacklisting on particular ranges of IP addresses, because scanning operations on certain embedded devices or let's say printers can cause them to puke and misbehave in pretty surprising ways that we would want to avoid, just in terms of a reputation thing and minimal disruption of the organization as we're doing these scans. And then those configurations are going to live up in a scanning database that gets pulled through an orchestrated series of Azure functions that run on an execution loop with a given time interval to check for new configurations, new events, when things are allowed to go, when they can trigger a scan, so that the scanning is happening on the end client in the anticipated orchestration loop that was defined from that command and control surface on the web app. And then from there, they're going to be parsing instructions in SQL format on a local client that's living in a Docker container, just because the scanner itself is Kali Linux and the code being run is Microsoft. And the final output of those scans is going to come in an XML format that gets parsed back down and sent out to the orchestration function that is responsible for parsing that information and loading it back into the scan database as a series of results. The entire time this is being done over secure connections. The interpretation portion of this is going to take answers from both the scanning database that we just covered and the assessment database, where people are populating answers to individual questions being posed to them along the assessment journey. And the report generation wizard is an out-of-band tool that's going to live on a Highground employee's desktop or as an executable that they can download from an internal repo, so that they can pull from either of these data sources on kind of a keychain utility basis. And its primary responsibility is to emulate what I would normally do as an analyst and generate a final PowerPoint that gets flattened into a PDF for delivery to the end client, containing all of these kinds of insights that we would normally glean and look for. Here's an example of charts that it has to build. You can think of this process almost exactly like XML parameters in a Word document, where you have a stand-in or a placeholder on said document that gets populated with the data from the correct source using some back-end logic or some template generation procedure operating on that provided document with all of those placeholders. And it would be building charts. This is the first example of one such chart where we're aggregating all of the answers in the IT portfolio spending portion of the assessment and the stated financial risk from ownership to determine what's the overall dollar amount or the risk threshold, the surface that a bad actor might have to shoot at by different risk categories or risk behaviors. And there's usually 1 to 3 that any particular business model is going to have as the largest predictor on where their focus should be. And that's going to help drive the attention for those program outlays I discussed at the beginning of this. Things like the overall breakdown of vulnerabilities across devices by IP or FQDN or whatever internal naming convention we can find in the environment, so that people can see where they should focus their patching efforts. The vulnerability count by area of concern, again with that same vulnerability data, but with respect to behaviors or the kinds of commitments you made to certain technology in your environment and what technologies are being ignored. If an organization is mostly on, they're using web applications and web services, EDI, to transfer information between different businesses, then their web services vulnerability threshold might look higher than something like just Windows vulnerabilities. And these trade-offs represent the kind of work that you're doing and the kind of areas that you need to focus on. Policy, law, and compliance, which is a big one. We would facilitate or ask for policies and analyze those for how robust they were, what kind of common concerns in compliance frameworks that they cover, if they're present at all, if they're not present and need to be completed in the future, just so that at any point, if you're in an environment where you would need to be audited, or you're trying to be proactive about managing the behavior of your users and increase efficiency around basic process behavior and outcomes in your organization, you should have these policies present, and we should know what kind of things they cover for. And a lot of the times this includes SOPs, something like doing incident command or common events with mobile device management policy or onboarding and offboarding employees have technical wrinkles that people should be able to point out in an SOP to do correctly, or catch cases for common events so that people are handling information safely and ensuring things are done to a particular standard. Benchmarking by area of spending, again, because this is a hugely insightful aspect of, things like ITIL are talking about tech portfolios and keeping them current and keeping them aligned with service execution in the organization, what the organization's core job is. And Highground saw itself as an actor in this space that wasn't out to sell cyber tools to people. It was out to align strategic vision with non-technical jargon down to the technical execution to make sure that everything was moving in the same direction. And cyber, at the end of the day, is just this core mission, but with the added aspects of security, because to defend everything is to defend nothing. You need to be focused on the things that actually matter to your organization. And when you see something in a breakdown like this, where there's virtually no security spending, and it's typically all infrastructure, data, and applications, but there's no higher level order thinking around your governance, risk, and compliance, the security, or the architecture to ensure that it's an organized mesh of that infrastructure, data, and applications, you end up with end-of-life devices. You end up with protocols that are way out of spec and insecure. You end up with these things that are being done on a reactive basis that aren't serving the organization. And when people see IT as a cost center, this only aggravates the kind of cost center that it really is, because these higher level management activities or longer term sets of thinking and allocating resources to that just aren't present. So you can't gain the efficiencies that you'd ever actually look for when IT is considered a cost center. You've got overall letter grading by analysis area here, so that each of these things that are being shown throughout a final presentation coalesce down into the most appropriate compliance framework or program and definition to shoot for, because sometimes it is an outside legal framework or standard that you're being held to by an organization you're taking money from in contracts. It's written in there. Or it's just something that would be nice to have. And in those cases, those nice to haves are, what's the quickest outcome we can achieve with the least amount of resources that gets us the most, again, alignment to strategic vision for the organization, because it's ultimately an elective process and you want to make sure that the quality of your cybersecurity is actually accomplishing something for you. Again, with the letter grading here, we're going by the different kinds of vulnerabilities that you might have seen in the earlier slide, just with more of a statement on the kind of quality in your patching and your overall lifecycle management around hardware, applications, and infrastructure. Budgeting, because as we're talking about program outlays and what's sensible, we're not putting our finger on the scale in this, and we're not about tools. There's going to be a variety of different ways to estimate what the appropriate level of spend is from a risk management standpoint on something like cybersecurity, and that's especially true of different organizations in different industries doing different things. Somebody like Kellogg's, who makes cereal, is primarily seeing IT as a cost center and might only be spending 2% of their overall top line on IT budgets, and then whatever percentage of that flows downhill into security is about protecting the house at the bare minimum. somebody who's a tech startup in a highly speculative space where the industry turns over every 2 or 3 years with a new hot solution is going to want to protect that solution at all costs and sees tech as a profit center, so they're willing to spend more. And so you're bracketing in this basic exercise to say, what can we determine you've spent already on areas of cybersecurity, if any, and then what's an appropriate range based off of your level of risk tolerance and your unique situation in the market and the industry you're serving in. Regarding the SCIF version of this application, the primary justification for this was that some clients prohibit the egress of security protections data, even if it's verified to be secure, because it could violate some core tenet that they have regarding data loss prevention. And we're talking about data that is essentially a playbook on how to wreck any particular device or gain access to any sensitive information in the organization in the event that it could be exploited, which is huge. And understandably, a lot of organizations have different levels of comfort around a command and control approach for trafficking that data around between Highground and their company. So if they demand an unbroken chain of custody that's almost entirely physical because they're not comfortable with a virtual approach to this, Highground would routinely test all of the protocols and the tunnels and the methods used to translate that data out of one environment into the other. But regardless, we're going to have to accommodate this use case. So what that means for me is doubling the workload and doing two things in parallel. I have to produce an ASP.NET MVC application that's going to live as that web portal version of this story, and also convert all of the same core functionalities using a shared code service library between the two applications, and recreate all of those UI behaviors and those UI screens like for like, one for one, in WPF, WinForms written in C# so that it can be hosted using a Docker image on the Kali Linux scanner itself. And at that point, the scanner is going to have two hats at the same time. It's going to first facilitate the assessment and get passed around physically within the organization, which degrades the asynchronous completion requirement that we would hope for in most organizations. And then after that, to ensure that the data is fresh as it possibly could be from a security technical vulnerability scanning perspective, with things like DHCP leases that might go stale in the time that it takes to analyze this data. It's going to perform both of those tasks in a sequential order as part of the overall execution of this assessment. It's going to get put back in a box and physically shipped to Highground, where the information never leaves the device. There's nothing that transfers over the wire or leaves the network for the client, and goes directly to Highground for that analysis. And collecting feedback with all of this in an iterative nature, most of it's being generated by Highground, and the primary concern is for the stakeholders within Highground who have to execute on this thing, because we're chasing after that margin performance, we're chasing after ease of use, we're trying to make this a scalable product, so the concerns are primarily from within the house. And then from outside the house, our bare minimum on this is that it should be faster to deliver. People should be able to complete it in a way that doesn't require as much friction, that it could be as guided as possible, and that they only need to reach out to Highground on an exception basis, so that there isn't as much coordination that has to happen, and all of this could hopefully be run with less friction. So edge cases here started to crop up right away. The problem with questions being posed dynamically is that it's not in a tree approach so much in a choose your own adventure path as much as it is a graph approach, where it pertains to several disciplines at the same time. So a question asked 10 questions ago with a particular kind of answer can preclude a set of questions or exclude other sets of questions and determine the path you're on, but then you ask the question in front of you a particular way, and it's going to touch other disciplines or other aspects or necessitate other questions being asked in the assessment that could throw off your understanding of how far you are into it, how much you have completed as a percentage, what other questions are going to be necessary to answer as a result of that. So trimming away redundant questions becomes a lot harder problem to solve in the lived reality than we initially anticipated. Then live fire testing and feedback with clients on the assessment journey led to an overwhelming preference amongst these small and mid-market organizations primarily for that web-based approach. They were perfectly willing to take the security protocols that we were testing and the methods of transmission that we had in and out of the environment at face value. They could take it on trust. And so the SCIF version stayed more or less in cold storage for the occasional client who did have that concern, and we had used it at one point. But overwhelming market feedback that the command and control approach over the web, where people could complete it on their own time in their own fashion, was the way to go. And then individual queries per question in this graph approach, in a depth first search kind of approach to the problem, caused serious massive slowdowns past roughly the 50 question mark. If you think about something like a binary search tree that's increasingly lopsided, if you go down the fullest exploration of any given path in the assessment, and you have to then look up recursively at any point deep enough in the assessment for the prior information present on questions that were already answered, that's going to cause the system to chug in pretty profound ways, and it's going to require some SQL query optimization in order to keep the assessment journey performant in an overall assessment that could have 250 questions in it. Walking through this journey, you can see an updated list of requirements here that I'm not going to read through, but you can certainly pause and see more of them in depth if you'd like to. Let's start getting into the technical aspects of the solution here, starting at solution architecture. And it looks fairly complicated, but the reality of having to automate all of the individual disciplines and activities involved in the service execution of a smart and safe assessment ended up having knock-on effects elsewhere in the organization, because if we can automate this once for a one-time project delivery, the same fundamental set of activities that were being done, let's say, in a program context on a recurring basis, started to have serious justification and cost benefits for Highground as a opportunity to win twice, the primary call out being scanning operations. Because scanning might happen once in a client organization, and if you don't want to handhold the entire process from start to finish, the same set of orchestration or scoping around those individual scans can be applied to a single client you service on a month-to-month basis with recurring scan operations. So we start to suss all of these things out and then choose appropriate solutions for them in a final architecture that I'm going to walk through here. The user for the assessment is going to come in through the Azure front door, where the IPs that they can request the application service from are geofenced. There's inspection on the headers and the body for stripping out unnecessary information, overwriting information, and ensuring that whoever is receiving something like the SMS one-time PIN to sign in with two-factor authentication to the service is coming from where they say they come from. They're not a man in the middle or any other such situation where people aren't getting access to information that they shouldn't. The application itself responsible for the assessment process is being hosted in Azure Web Apps. And then it has shared access to a number of different SQL tables responsible for different things. There's going to be tables in Azure SQL responsible for the command and control information that dictates scanning. That is the CIDR IP ranges that are in scope for a particular scan, any scheduling for that scan, if it needs to happen more than once, or you want to pre-allocate when that scan should take place, because there's going to be ideal windows to avoid network disruptions or slowdowns for clients as their people are doing work on a daily basis. You're going to have the assessment table that stores all of those pre-built assessments and question banks and information and dependencies between questions on that guided path throughout the assessment. And then individual answers that users provide on a per client and per assessment basis, so that you can see what path of the graph they walked through with their questions and how they answered, and then pull on the actual assessment answers themselves. And then similarly, distinct from command and control, you're going to have the answers with regards to scan data. We want to have repeatable sets of orchestration activities in one database, and then over in the other database, we're going to capture all of the fingerprinted information in client environments. And to make sense of that, the application responsible for the assessment process and then other applications and Highground services that would be offered later would be making pulls via API integration from the National Vulnerability Database and MITRE's CVE and CPE databases to get additional information and context around the kind of vulnerabilities we were fingerprinting in client environments. Things like the CVSS score, which is a measure of criticality, active exploits, feasible threat vectors, mitigation information on how to potentially patch some of these threats, All of that was being included, and it was being stacked up in the scanner data databases on an additive basis, so that there's a basic pattern matching approach being done. When you run a given suite of scans, looking for particular kinds of threats on a credentialed or uncredentialed basis, that gets aggregated up in the scanner data database along with known threats and known CVEs, CPEs, patterns, activities, applications that could be detected, OSs that could be detected, and this provides a dearth of analytical data to choose from and patterns to go and find in an organization to produce these final reports, which ultimately leads down to the desktop application of that interpretation wizard, which is pulling from all of these three together in unison and drawing those through lines with common patterns that I would have noticed over the past several years and wanted to hard code or provide a general sense at which it rolls up into a series of intelligible reports, and then I can go back in later, again as the primary analyst, having to do way less work and just provide commentary with notes in the margins on these kinds of patterns that you would see across organizations and the kinds of things I've seen 50, 100 times. And I, as the local developer in this solution, I'm authenticating with Azure Active Directory, Entra ID nowadays, the artist formerly known as Azure Active Directory. And I'm making Git commits up in Azure DevOps, which is GitHub under the hood, so that with regards to application architecture here, I've broken it down into views, services, and objects. And the object map is pretty sprawling. You think of this as something that ends up as a final set of tables inside of SQL. And I've broken it vertically here. Everything on the left has to do with the assessment journey itself, and everything on the right has to do with scanning operations. Now, scanning is a lot easier to understand. You're going to have an individual scan, which is the collection of everything that could be found at a given point in time, being run sequentially from start to finish. And it's going to find a series of hosts that are in scope for what was configured to begin with. You're going to have individual findings on each of those hosts, and then you're going to have things like applications present on the device that could be fingerprinting from registry or other active processes that were found to be running, things like the operating system, and things like CVEs or known vulnerabilities that pertain to either of those or other misconfigurations or protocol level issues on that device. And there's a lot of other things that are tied to the host that I couldn't necessarily fit in the view here. Over on the left side, to get into the aspects of the assessment, at a top level, more administrative perspective, the interview is the core driver of all of the underlying information present. And an interview is how you manage the one-to-many relationship between an assessment that lives on the shelf and is repeatable and the individualized application of that assessment to a client. And within assessments are going to be broken down into multiple sections, and those sections are going to be containing multiple questions. Now, the question is stored in kind of a bank format, and it can be opted into or out of particular sections as you're building assessments from this administrative view. And questions are going to be linked to each other via dependencies in a path, and they're going to have given parameters that can be answered or required in the question so that they can be pulled on later by that analytics engine. So if I'm looking for a particular topic or concern, or hey, how would I know what the budget for this company's IT spending is? There's going to be an IT budget parameter that gets pinned to a particular kind of question that you can edit, retroactively add, or remove in the maintenance of your question banks. And then the encounter you can kind of see at the center of this web. That is the nexus point for handling user interactions with this repeatable assessment structure and all the different kinds of analysis implications or objects that might be drawn out of that later. A user is going to come into the application and they're going to walk through the assessment journey as it's pre-configured over by those assessment objects, and they're going to generate responses to individual questions, but they can't generate them to the question itself because the question is intended to be repeatable. It's intended to be something that you can slot in and out of assessments, dynamically change later, and you're going to have multiple questions with multiple users answering those questions. In a team-based format, people can overwrite or step on each other's inputs. People could go back and retroactively change things later. So a response gets bound up to an encounter, and the encounter is just that, kind of like the name implies, one-time instance where everything collides together and you first encounter the question or follow on and encounter it again later. And encounters are where we hang most of the rich information that the analytics engine is going to be relying on to make sense of the assessment and the answers people provided. An encounter determines whether or not that question was trimmed away from the final path along the graph. Things like allocation information, and allocation has to do primarily with percentages of resource time, an individual or a department, and what they're spending on key activities from an ITIL service portfolio management perspective. You're going to have spending splits that have a predefined understanding of what share a bundled service or application might be providing in capacity. If you're using something like Google for Enterprise or Microsoft 365 E5 or government licensing, things like that have different stated levels of capacity in different areas of your IT spending portfolio. So you're breaking those capacities that you're paying for across their correct areas of IT spending on those final reports that we provide according to the final amount that you're spending per license or per user. And you've got information like aggregated spending across particular kinds of categories and resources present in your environment, either as internal departments, because that's the most effective way to organize it logically for you, or individual resources because you have smaller teams, or external vendors providing some service to you. And most of this information would be hung on a question on a per parameter basis. And then with questions, those questions are also used in their configuration to outline where in the assessment something like these encounter related fields that you're seeing get prompted to the user. And dependencies are how you track questions linkages to each other in this overall graph path of the assessment. And you've got things like documents that can also be hung on encounters because those are critically important. If you're asking for contract information so that Highground can review that, or policy information so people can review the maturity or the presence at all of policies within your organization against some appropriate compliance framework for what you're doing, documents are being hung on questions, and then the uploads from particular users who were most authoritative on those questions were being handled through a document object in a one-to-one or one-to-many relationship with those encounters. Then we've got our services, and you've got the interview service and the document service responsible for handling the flow of the assessment application that the end user is going to see, and the storage of documents and the statuses on these to determine where in that final stoplight view in the presentation of findings a document's disposition or policy's disposition might land, so that a user doesn't have to do that by hand to a reasonable degree. They're still going to have to read through some of that information. And you've got services for exporting the results to the interpretive engine. And you've got the presentation service within the interpretive engine that takes the boiled down and the automation of certain patterns and trends being done during the analysis phase into those empty slots, those placeholders in a PowerPoint template that then ultimately gets baked down to a final PDF that shows up and gets delivered to the client in an executive session. And then you've got the scanner service pursuant to the solution architecture that you would have seen earlier, that's mechanically handling up in Azure Functions the orchestration of individual tasks and the setting the scope of scanning operations within clients. Our views are broken down across your core assessment views that a user actually gets to experience, and then our admin views that Highground employees get to manage and interface with the solution and dictate certain items. Question pages, section intro at the beginning of each section of the assessment to provide a lay of the land and provide some helpers or understanding around what's coming, what kind of resources you might need on hand, and the kind of topics that are going to get covered so you know how to be thinking about things. A basic homepage to navigate around to the sections that are unlocked and what people should be allowed to complete given their skill sets, and a total tutorial bank on all of the items being covered. The section intro videos would live there. You've got assessment health, and the assessment health view was primarily responsible for seeing, how that shifting scale of percent complete on this changing journey looks, any past unanswered questions that people might have skipped, or new questions that might have opened up the need answering based off of the context of what's currently known around the organization and the questions that have been answered. And then a document library to see the disposition on all possible policies or contract information that Highground would be asking for, and what the statuses of those are based off of prior uploads and what people have said is true of the organization and what does and doesn't apply to them in the questions being asked. And then from the admin side, I or anyone else who's configuring these assessments is going to be configuring those aggregated spend categories, known licenses or known vendors who have a lot of these bundling strategies so that we can pre-allocate what those spends look like as a respect of IT budgets that people enter into the system on those licenses. You've got the ability to manage users belonging to separate clients as they move through the assessment and manage the assessments themselves, manage the interviews and pre-configure them so that you can kind of have an unveiling or cut the rope line and let people into the system when their assessments are ready, specific to that client, specific to that assessment. And then the general repeatable views for managing questions, managing how encounters are ordered inside of sections, and then managing sections that go into a final assessment so that those assessments, again, are repeatable and our question banks are repeatable and everything is easier to maintain overall. With regards to tools and frameworks being used here, again, it's a little bit more jumbled because there's multiple bands or areas of work to use these tools in when you're talking about a web solution, that desktop skiffed version of the solution, and then handling scanners themselves. But I've broken it across web, desktop, and the connectivity used for remote administration. Simplest to cover is that Real VNC was the tool being used for remote administration of scanner assets as they were being deployed in environments physically as a laptop. And then the desktop tooling to facilitate the scans and build out the scanning solution had to do with Docker to support that cross-OS imaging issue of building a Microsoft-based tool with .NET and running it locally on Kali Linux, performing those scanning operations. And as I mentioned earlier, with the skiffed version of the application that was built front to back in WinForms, WPF, in C# primarily, and just torturing what WinForms is normally capable of to produce those final UIs in a responsive fashion and emulate a lot of the same UI behaviors that would be true of the web application. And then with web, it's a recurring stack of tools that I use in a lot of other places. I've since broadened a little bit and migrated away from some of these tools, something like Foundation or jQuery, for instance. Foundation is a one-for-one with Bootstrap. It's a UI presentation framework that uses a lot of flex boxes and grid-based approaches to things and trying to keep things responsive by default, using CSS3 and HTML, and then using jQuery as an alternative to JavaScript just for the shortcuts on manipulating the DOM. And then on the back end is written in .NET 5 at the time. It's an MVC application with Razor pages, and using Postman for a lot of the API and networking and coordination activities between these various resources to ensure that things are working appropriately. Twilio SMS was the platform being used for those one-time pins being sent out from a pre-approved phone number that Highground had for those bulk communications, either in a marketing context or in a system support and follow-up context. And then in the data stack, Entity Framework as the ORM is an out-of-the-box answer for a lot of Microsoft solutions if you're in the .NET space. And SQL Server Management Studio for designing all of these tables, handling the entity relationships across those tables, and building stored procedures to sideload those assessment questions in bulk. Different activities like that where SQL Server Management can carry a lot of water. Timeline here begins in roughly April of 2021, and this becomes the primary project that I'm responsible for during my time in 2021 up until the end of the year. You'll see that I have another case study where I'm doing CRM migration to Dynamics 365, and while I was doing that concurrently, it was not nearly as much of a lift as this was because there's so many different moving pieces. Development for it begins in April of 2021 and continues until September, at which point we're doing some basic integration testing internally to see how all of these different pieces of the solution are fitting together, if they're talking to each other correctly, doing dry runs on internal scans of our own environments to eat our own dog food and confirm everything's working appropriately, managing through the user experience of completing an assessment, and then the internal user testing process and those question edits around shaping what the path can look like and all the different appropriate areas it would go for different kinds of clients we've had in the past or different versions of the assessment we've run is more or less locked in by the end of November of 2021. And we can have a go live and an announcement that it's ready for use. And this new unveiling and new model for service delivery on the Smart and Safe gets a corresponding set of videos to explain it in a virtual tour. It takes roughly 12 minutes to explain, where beforehand trying to explain this to clients in sales pitches and convincing them on it could take an hour, hour and a half. And then the person who signed on the dotted line for the delivery of this assessment has to loop in 4, 5, 6 other stakeholders in their different domains of responsibility, be it marketing and sales or IT or operations or finance, so that they can answer these questions authoritatively. And then we start the whole process over again, right? So just some service delivery improvements to be made there in conjunction with actually shipping this product. And then after January of 2022, where all of this has got a pretty neat bow on it and we're putting it in front of clients and clients are regularly swinging at it, we've got optimizations and client feedback of the assessment journey, different things like that slowdown on questions, having to recursively search back for prior context to present the correct questions moving forward through the assessment, become more of an issue and require more work on those active SQL optimizations. And it's about tightening the speed of delivery and tightening the quality that's presented to the final client as they're going through it, and trying to focus on the external concerns of making sure this is at the minimum easier than doing this by hand, and at best the prettiest and the smoothest, most lubricated assessment process you could have for something where we are kind of painfully and exhaustively talking about every aspect of your business from front to back in order to make a higher level judgment of the most appropriate cyber footing an organization should have. And then from March of 2020 to present, it's been system maintenance and support around the delivery of these assessments. And when it comes to reviewing the final outputs of the assessment wizard, still providing occasional markup on the notes, going through policies, going through contracts that organizations provide in the process of doing this, to follow that red thread wherever it may go and be that palm reader on business intelligence around the kind of decisions that are most appropriate for that given company's direction in cybersecurity. So we can talk about all of this, but I want to actually show and demonstrate the solution in action. You've got an example of the home page demonstrating the principle of least privilege with users who might have one or multiple knowledge domains. They get enrolled in the process and tapped by an individual stakeholder who signed on the dotted line for a Smart and Safe project. And then if they're in HR, if they're in operations or finance or IT, they're going to be handed one or several sets of roles corresponding to that discipline and expected to answer sections within this assessment or locked out of given sections based off of what's being discussed and whether or not they need access to that info. You can see over on the left-hand side that there's percentage completions, and that's across the entire team so that you can see or know, given some background information during the enrollment process, if X person is responsible for Y section, then they're the one who has to go and complete that so that the assessment can move forward. And hopefully there can be some burden sharing between the client, organization, and Highground in completing these assessments. Then you've got intros at the beginning of every section with a tutorial video doing some table setting around what information is going to be covered, what to have on hand and ready to answer your questions, and then some additional context around what we're looking for. As you move through each question, there's going to be a variety of different question types and help text over on the right-hand side to preempt common questions that you would normally receive in real time during a phone conversation before this solution was in place. And people have the ability to skip through and circle back to questions if they aren't required, and the ability to add notes or color commentary, which won't impact the analysis being done by the engine, but for an analyst like me who sees all of these in a final view in a spreadsheet, being able to see why they answered the way they did or some justification helps with my writing of notes in the margins on the final presentations. Then you've got additional question types pertaining to that resource allocation point I pointed out earlier with our tables and how the application architecture works. Things like resource allocation, entering the names of individuals in an IT team, let's say, or different departments responsible for some overarching set of obligations, outlining what you spend on each of those so that you can do a breakdown in your portfolio by the resources contributing, the assets you have on hand, the kind of services you're delivering, all from kind of that ITIL perspective, get entered in here and then can be broken down later. And you can understand why, if you're enumerating all the resources in your environment and how much they're paid per year, maybe that's sensitive information as well. It's compensation data that certain people shouldn't have access to, right? Here you can see an example of a document library. Now, the assessment, as you walk through it, is going to ask you about particular kinds of activities your organization does that either exclude you or include you in a set of policy documents that are going to be necessary to do what you do effectively, or if you were ever audited, let's say, from an outside compliance perspective, to say that you have these documents. Collecting all that information about the organization itself, but then also what do you have from a compliance perspective and a starting point that's going to drive your program outlays and your behaviors. The assessment does that, and this is the final view that you can jump to at any point throughout the assessment to see what the status on any of these individual contract uploads or policy uploads might be. Either it doesn't apply to you and you're exempted from having to care about it, either it's completed and it's counting towards your final progression in the assessment, you've acknowledged it's not present, you don't have it, you're not providing it, or it still needs action because it hasn't been encountered yet in the assessment, or you decided to just skip through it, blow past it, and you're going to need to circle back and actually provide a document in some form, whether it's something that's scribbled on a bar napkin or a 12-page document that people are actively maintaining with SOPs and all of it. Then you've got assessment health, and this is where the aircraft carrier managing the coming and going of all the individual aircraft happens. You're going to have multiple team members circling around performing these activities in the assessment, and there's going to be sections that people haven't begun yet, they're in progress, they don't have access to, and they need context clues as to why they can't get to certain information. They want to be able to continue from where they left off in the assessment, or they want to see how many remaining questions they have, which could be changing depending on prior answers, and be able to effectively navigate a spread of questions by area so that as things move around in this kind of graph approach, it's relatively simple to move back and forth and get to completion in a way that's intelligible for the user and for multiple users who may have different answers on topics, let's say, or who's on first and who's on third base when it comes to answering particular questions that touch on multiple topics. Then you've got the tutorial view. Finally, just the place to reiterate all those intro sections, and for people who might not have access to those sections to be able to see what's being covered in those areas and what the other people are actually doing, so that everyone's got some shared understanding of where this assessment goes and all the different kinds of concerns that Highground has when completing this assessment. Looking at admin views, it's relatively simple as far as CRUD applications go. You can manage the users in the system at any given point in time. You can manage your question bank and all the underlying data, editing each question so that you write once, save, and it applies everywhere. You've got the ability to configure what goes in individual sections with questions and the order in which encounters are presented in an assessment to the end user, and then the ability to configure how those sections show up in an assessment. Then you've got the ability to produce things like those aggregate spend categories that people could pick from and a pick list throughout the assessment. M365 for Business Basic as an example, where the report shown earlier on that final presentation of findings with the radar diagram across the different IT spending categories, this would lay out what the overall allocation and capacity for that money being spent went to as far as sub niches in that radar diagram. All right, so a lot to go over, but let's talk about final benefits and wrap this up. 90% reduction on input costs. That sounds outlandish, I know, but as the person doing the work primarily, the hands-on activity to analyze all this data and compile those reports with meaningful trends and information that's going to make an impact and guide decision making at an executive level, to boil all that down and reduce it to that audience required 60 hours of work per assessment on average. But with all of these solutions in place, as a result of this, it took me on average 6 hours to now just complete notes in the margin, read through the information, the kinds of places I would normally look. I was well accustomed to going there and could boil it down incredibly quickly, matching against what was already produced from the analytics engine. So we've got a huge reduction in input costs as a result of that and preserving the margin that we aimed for to begin with. We removed human constraints here too in a pretty big way, because the asynchronous completion of the delivery of the assessments unjammed a lot of the coordination efforts that happened inside of these projects, and it allowed for as many as 3 additional concurrent assessments to happen with no additional overhead on that coordination. So we were really only constrained now by the number of active scanner devices we could have juggling at the same time amongst clients in our inventory. And then we have second order revenue streams that get spawned as a result of this automation effort. The command and control capabilities that we developed for this solution ended up being implemented in our scanning of client networks as its own threat and attack surface management subservice in the programs that we're doing with clients to consult and improve their cybersecurity and run cyber programs as a week-to-week, month-to-month persistent activity. So that meant a 0 additional cost in maintenance or labor to perform this same fundamental activity in a totally different service with different cash flow implications, greater profit margins, and could be done on an hourly basis, let's say, as consulting work. All right, this one is a big one, but if you watched all the way to the end or you like what you saw, thanks for watching. My name is Ethan Barnhart, founder of Vulcan Digital, and if you have any problems you want solved, you want to see similar benefits in your organization, don't hesitate to reach out. You can see my contact information in the card below. Stay safe and have a good one.